It was the most critical meeting in the tense weeks before the Iraq War. Face-to-face talks in the White House between President Bush and Tony Blair, along with their most senior officials. Channel 4 News has seen a secret memo which details that discussion between the two leaders. The President makes it clear there'll be war on Saddam regardless of whether the UN passes a further resolution. The Prime Minister replies he is, quotes, solidly with the President. And George Bush even floats the idea of trying to lure Saddam into war by flying an American spy plane over Iraq painted in UN colours. The details are contained in a new version of the book Lawless World by the leading international lawyer Philippe Sands QC. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this exclusive report.
January 31st, 2003. Tony Blair is heading to the White House. This would be one of the most critical meetings in the build-up to war. France, Germany, Russia and many in Britain wanted the UN inspections in Iraq to have more time. Saddam Hussein had made what he called a full declaration of his past chemical and biological weaponry. But with forces mounting on Iraq's border, Tony Blair knew war was almost certainly not far off. He wanted the world to unite against Saddam. He wanted the US to back a second resolution at the United Nations. But there had been no smoking gun found in Iraq to turn round world opinion, and both leaders knew it. Channel 4 News has seen a memo of the White House meeting which records that critical summit. The memo paints a picture of two leaders intensely aware that even though they think Saddam Hussein has done enough to justify war, much of the world is disagreeing and angry. The White House meeting memo conveys an air of desperation as the two leaders cast around for how world opinion might be turned. The White House meeting memo says President Bush told Mr. Blair the US was thinking of flying U-2 reconnaissance aircraft with fighter cover over Iraq, painted in UN colours. If Saddam fired on them, he would be in breach. The US had in the past flown spy planes over Iraq. It had flown them in the colours and service of the UN, but a senior UN source told us they were perfectly capable of flying above the range of Iraqi missiles, and the fighter escorts and talk of Saddam firing on them suggests to some that the US was almost willing Saddam to strike out at the plane.
I think the context is clear that by January 2003 it appears that the British Prime Minister and the US President were conscious that they had no evidence of their own, that it was increasingly likely that Hans Blix would not come up with the big smoking gun that Jack Straw wanted, and that they would therefore have to procure a material breach through some other means. And I think against that background it's very hard to find a charitable explanation for this type of discussion between the heads of these two countries.
We've gone through all senior people in the administration, the papers preparing for such a meeting. And it means that at senior levels in the US administration, crazy, illegal, deceitful proposals like that were actually being contemplated to trigger a war by deceit.
We just had a wide-ranging discussion on a lot of issues.
A new book by the international lawyer Philippe Sands makes clear that Mr. Blair at this meeting also heard the President suggest there might be other ways of altering the course of events. The book gives details of the White House meeting memo in which President Bush says it was also possible that a defector could be brought out who would give a public presentation about Saddam's WMD, and there was also a small possibility that Saddam would be assassinated. But Mr. Blair doesn't seem to be too optimistic about those possibilities, and he pursues the main reason for his trip to the US. He wants President Bush to throw his weight behind an attempt to get a second UN resolution authorising war. Mr. Blair's been advised he needs it to have a hope of getting parliamentary backing for war. President Bush is being advised by much of his top team not to go near the United Nations again. According to the White House meeting memo, the Prime Minister said that a second Security Council resolution would provide an insurance policy against the unexpected and international cover, including with the Arabs.
What is important is that the international community comes together again and makes...
President Bush would later refer to this two-hour meeting as the famous second resolution meeting. He did agree, against the advice of many in his administration, to give the UN another try. But he also made it clear that even if there was no second UN resolution, war would happen and soon. The White House meeting memo, seen by Channel 4 News outside the UK, records that President Bush said the US would put its full weight behind efforts to get another resolution and would twist arms and even threaten. But he had to say that if ultimately we failed, military action would follow anyway. Tony Blair responds that he is solidly with the president and ready to do whatever it took to disarm Saddam. Just before the meeting with President Bush, Mr. Blair gave a round of interviews at the British Embassy in Washington. He was asked, was there already a date in the diary for war?
Well, no, there's not a specific deadline that we have alighted upon.
But later, at the White House meeting, Mr. Blair learnt there was a specific date President Bush had in mind, the 10th of March. The window for winning round the rest of the world to a new UN resolution was tight and pretty much immovable. War actually began on March the 20th.
Joining the President at the meeting were his then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, her deputy Dan Fried, and the Chief of Staff for the White House Andrew Card. The Prime Minister took along his then Security Advisor David Manning, along with his then Foreign Policy aide Matthew Rycroft and his Chief of Staff Jonathan Powell. The whole tone of the White House meeting seems to be two leaders who don't feel they have enough evidence of a breach to convince the world. But their own position is that Saddam is already in breach because of lack of cooperation with inspectors. But that doesn't appear to be the view of the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, according to a private letter he sent Tony Blair in early January 2003, reported in a new book by the international lawyer Philippe Sands.
Mr. Straw's note seems to indicate his belief that as of January 2003, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was not in material breach. And of course, if Saddam Hussein's Iraq was not in material breach at the beginning of January 2003, nothing happened after that date to bring him into material breach, and it means that the entire argument of material breach unravels.
Back at the 30th January meeting, President Bush told the Prime Minister he didn't expect Iraq to erupt in violence after its liberation. President Bush told Mr. Blair he thought it unlikely that there would be internecine warfare between the different religious and ethnic groups. British journalists accompanying the Prime Minister were given a document supposed to strengthen the case for war, but a chunk of it turned out to be lifted off the internet. It would become known as the dodgy dossier. The Prime Minister was running out of time to win round opinion, and in Washington and London some of the attempts to turn things round were looking increasingly ragged and desperate.